Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is truly an honor to be able to talk to you today on something that I have really about as much passion as anything that I have for in life, and that is the future of the ANU. It's a talk that I think is time to be had because the future is not certain for this institution, and this is a great institution. So I guess that was with some surprise on Sunday that this photo was sent to me from one of my friends wandering around Canberra. ANU no longer great. So I have to admit was rather amazed how words from presumably a sub-editor that presumably I said were rearranged to such effect. But the positive side is there are so many of you out here to listen to this talk today. Now, I am a pragmatic but ultimately very positive individual, and so one of the things you will not be hearing today is pessimism. But you will hear pragmatism, and some of you may find that confronting. But I am telling you it's time to be confronted and then to look to the future positively. And that's the way I have always run my life. One of the great things about the Canberra Times article is it brought comments from far afield. And my inbox has been loaded up with things, for example, from Glyn Davis from the University of Melbourne, not someone who normally fills my inbox with correspondence. And, but I thought he actually provided a useful set of comments for us to reflect on, because people like Glyn are going to be having these conversations with or without us, and we need to be part of this conversation. Glyn, after reading the Canberra Times article, which resembled something that I was thinking, said, far from being disadvantaged by present policy, the ANU receives substantial research funds available to no other Australian university. That is true. This is $180 million, $177 million, I believe, was the actual answer, through our national institutions grants. And this special funding has been provided to the ANU for decades. Many in the sector would welcome debate about the important role of the national university. There is, however, a tough question often asked about the ANU. Given generations of privileged funding, why is the institution not already the elite institution you propose? And I will be proposing to you an elite institution today, but I am not saying it's not an elite institution today. And that is a difference. It is one your speech might like to consider also. And so, it is that premise, that second premise, that I am going to spend time considering today. All right? You can see Glyn may have a certain view by the way his phrase was constructed, but let's look at the foundations of the ANU, of how it started. So, the ANU was built from nothing, starting in 1946. And the nation built the ANU to fill a gap that was recognized, a gap that there was almost no research conducted in this country of world class. There were essentially no PhD programs, and the ANU was brought on to fill this gap, to give Australia a world-class capacity in research, in what was considered to be, emerging areas that were going to be important for the nation's future. And I think you can say that when we look at how we did, we delivered a great legacy, a legacy of science, a legacy of research in the humanities. I always like to say, and this is where I get into arguments with the current Vice Chancellor, but I'm going to stick to my guns. I don't care that Florey came here afterwards. I mean, I think that's great that he did, but I don't believe we had anything to do with his development of penicillin. He's a great person. It was great he was part of this place. But Eccles did his research at this institution. Peter Doherty and co. did their research at this institution. I did my research at this institution. Frank Fenner did his research at this institution. When you look across Australia, there are 6 Nobel Prizes where the work was done in Australia. 6. 3 of them are at this institution. Only one other university, the University of Western Australia, has a Nobel Prize done at that institution. We have 3. The rest of the 37 universities have 1. That is a huge difference between us and any other university. And we should never forget it. We can say we have 15 alumni, and then everyone else looks pretty good, but the work was not done here. It was done overseas. So do not let people undermine what we have achieved at this institution. The legacy, though, goes beyond just the Nobel Prizes. The tapestries that you can see out here in the foyer represent Frank Fenner's work, as well as the 3 different Nobel Prizes that have been done at this institution. And we have a huge range of staff. The difference between a Nobel Prize and a great scientist is normally a twist of fate. And by having many, many great scientists, you have the opportunity of having Nobel Prizes emerge. So the fact that we have had 3 Nobel Prizes doesn't mean we have 3 great people. It means we have 1,000 upon 1,000 great people. Because it's only by having those thousands of people that we can possibly imagine getting a Nobel Prize to emerge. Because it does require, in my case, the universe to be doing something it wasn't supposed to be doing. I was doing good work, but if the universe had been behaving as it should have, I wouldn't have won a Nobel Prize. I would have still done great work. And so that's what happens across the sector. So it goes beyond a lot of individuals, and we can look at our alumni and realize it's not just researchers that this university produces. It's produced a huge number of federal politicians. We have 2 prime ministers and many, many sitting members and many, many people here, and this is just, I don't even think, a complete list. We populate the diplomatic corps of this country. We have business people at the highest level. And it turns out we also have populated the last 2 vice chancellors at the University of Melbourne. So there is the tough question of that Glenn Davis asked. Why is it not already the elite institution, I propose? And the answer is, given the resources available, ANU rose from the 1946 foundation through the 70s to become exactly what it should have been. It became Australia's most prestigious university, and by a large margin. It was a top 20 to 50 university worldwide, and it served as a nucleus for research which now thrives in this country. And we should be proud of that. But is there trouble? Well, the fact that I'm talking here today is, yes, I think we need to look forward. There is a potential storm on the horizon. And we should not be complacent. And I would argue we have been a bit complacent at this university, not universally, but we have, having had a very clear mandate in the first 30 years of this university, that mandate of what we are is now under threat. And so the conversation I'm going to have with you now is one out of love for the institution, not out of contempt in any way, shape, or form. I like to think of it as illustrated in these pictures, which is it's time to take a look at ourselves, ask what we're maybe need to change, because if we do not change what we're not doing right now, there will be consequences later on. And in the same way that I would go and potentially tell President Obama, as my president, that maybe those Mackers and those cigarettes that you used to have are going to come out bad in the long term, I'm here to tell you that there are things that we need to be worried about today, because if we don't, they are going to come out bad. And we can already see the beginnings of that today. So if we look after the 70s, I'm going to be a bit critical of the institution in hindsight. It's easy to look back in hindsight and be critical. And I'm not ascribing blame. I'm looking back and I say, our rise, ANU reached its current level of preeminence in the 70s. We have not moved substantially since the 70s. And this is partially because of our success. We were supposed to nucleate research, and we did. Our people went across this nation and set up strong research departments in the nation's universities. The group of 8 plus others. And so we have competition from other universities for resources. We, I would say, had a poor lack of engagement with other universities in that they ultimately resented who and what we were because we tended to work in our own sphere, largely overseas. And this is not 100%, but this was a common theme that I see today when I meet people over the age of 60. They still spit at my feet because I'm from the ANU. They cannot get past it. The young people from the same universities kind of go, what is going on? But the resentment is so deep in the over 60 crowd that I didn't have to be here to know it exists, because it's still there. This has led to erosion in our core funding block. That is the Institute of Advanced Study block, and it has essentially been eroded by inflation. During this time, we've had a huge cohort of international excellence, but people get older. Most great work, like it or not, is done by people under the age of 50 and often under 40. And we've had retirement of the superstars built up in this place from the 1950s and 70s. And we have replaced a lot of them. But I think if you look and say, relative to where we were in 1970, what is the fraction of superstars on this faculty? We may have just as many, but it's not as large a fraction. In the end, this led to us in 2002 to essentially have a gun against our head. The gun was, we're going to continue to erode away your block grant, or you can give up part of that block grant and join the National Research Competitive Grant System and compete for funding, which is likely to increase. So we joined. I don't think we really had a choice in 2002, although I question that decision now after the fact, because it turned out that we did join the Australian Research Council, the NMHRC. The ARC went through a rapid growth and then a leveling, but they continued to not index our block grant. And I don't think that was something we signed up for, but it is what has happened. And so where do we find us now? Well, this is going to be my most negative slide, which is that since 2002, ANU has gone backward in all international rankings. We are no longer, as I will demonstrate to you, clearly Australia's leading university. It used to be, without question, we were. It's not, we don't clearly differentiate on that anymore. We are no longer obviously different than the other G8 universities, and we are the smallest of the G8 universities by a substantial margin in the smallest city by a substantial margin. And that means we lack many of the associated industries, associated institutions, associated state funding that other places can rely on. We do have the federal government, which does counteract some of that. And so many people like to go through and compare essentially the University of Melbourne, and I know we have the Admiral here in the audience. That is the HMS Melbourne. And I think we at the ANU think of us as sort of being Australia 2, a nice little lean yacht. And we are on a collision course where we are about to get cut into. That is the wrong way to pose this problem, because the ANU is not here to undermine our competition. We are here to enhance the sector. We really need to think of us going through not as being mutual threats, because I should say Melbourne sees us as being a threat as well. I don't think I would have got that message from Glyn Davis had they not. But we should not see each other as a mutual threat. We need to be different and complementary. And I'm afraid that the University of Melbourne is moving in a straight direction, is not going to change course. But we have the advantage of being small and really much more able to change with the times if we are willing and able to do so. And I should say the reason we need to work together is that from a government perspective, It isn't Melbourne versus ANU. The competition is actually huge Chinese universities that dwarf even our largest universities, and sleek, lean US elite universities, which dwarf essentially our capacity. And so we're going to compete. We have to compete with the external ones, and we need to do that together, working constructively rather than against each other. So what makes a great university? Well, I thought about this, and turns out other people have said the same thing, so I figure it's got to be close to being correct. You can disagree. But I would say a great university, if you look at the great universities of the world, they're built upon their research, their students, past and present. Alumni are a very important part of a university, as are the current cohort, and their engagement with the larger community. So let's look at some of these things and say, what made ANU a great university? ANU had a lot of resources compared to other places. We had more research dollars per staff member by a considerable amount because of our unique funding arrangement. And you can translate dollars into research, which translates ultimately into prestige. They're one-to-one. Don't believe the clever country crap. It's crap. It's money that you spend. It all adds up. You might get lucky, but ultimately you're going to be run down if you're under-resourced. Now let's look at how the ANU's funding has changed since the 18 years I've been here. In 1995, when I got here, the ANU, and I put this in for the economists in the audience, I am married to one, in real dollars, so that means I've taken out CPI. You might want to think at a university that's largely wages, you might want to do wages. My wife told me that was wrong. Dean Terrell, you can correct me later on. But ultimately, when we got here, the block grant was 50% of everything we did. It is now 18% of everything we do. In other words, 82% of our funding is like the funding that every other university in this country has. Same rules, same everything. We are not much different, and especially since that 82% pushes around the 18% rather than the other way around. So we are bigger than we were when I arrived here, substantially, but we are very different. Note that the block grant has dropped both in nominal and especially real terms. It has dropped by almost a factor of 2 in real terms. That is a huge change, which is ultimately undermining our ability to be different. And we have to understand that where our money comes from is not dissimilar to almost any other university in the country. It almost entirely comes from the federal government. And so you can go through and you can try to, ask the state government for more money, or you can try to go through and, build up our endowment. But in the short term, those are small perturbations. Ultimately, we are beholden to the federal government's funding. So how exactly do we get our money from the federal government? Well, largely we get it from teaching. Well, not so much us. Turns out we're by far and away the smallest place. And so Commonwealth government funds places, and here's what it looks like. Across the top panel, you can see all of the G8, and you will note there's little ANU that has about half the next largest university's Commonwealth-funded places. And so for every student we have, we get money. And it doesn't matter where you are, you get the same amount of money if you have a similar student. Doesn't matter if you do a great job and you have them placed with a Nobel Prize winner or, great research staff, or you pump them through as quickly as you can. You get the same amount of money. That is a fundamental policy flaw, in my opinion, with the current system. That is killing us, as I will show you, because we are arguably by far and away, the best place to get an education in this country. Not all students are equal. If you do law, commerce, overseas students, those clearly make money. They turn a profit, allowing you to cross-subsidize your other activities. Science degrees, of which ANU is particularly focused on, are the ones that are about cost neutral. It's very hard to actually figure it out in detail, but no one believes that you're going to make a profit. Certainly, we have a problem because we do have a very elite law program, but we're not flooding. We have the limited capacity to take on huge numbers of students. That is not what we are, a huge university. And so we are unable to build up large amounts of income from taking on large numbers of what I would describe as ultimately possibly mediocre students. How else do we do it? Well, we also earn money by doing research. And so if you look at research income, you can see that ANU is sort of midway. We're a smaller institution. We do all right in this measure, but we're not noticeably different in terms of the bottom panel, which shows essentially the research income, and I'll show another graph on this in a second, per person on staff. The University of Melbourne, for example, earns more money right now per staff member than we do. That is a huge change, and that includes our money from the Institute Advanced Study Grant. Okay, that's a huge change. Remember, elite outcomes are based on money. Melbourne now has more money than we do per person. This is particularly bad because full cost of research is not supported. Every dollar we earn needs roughly 66 cents in addition to help fund the overheads, which is not paid for. We underwrite this with our block grant and with the small number of appropriate students we have. Other universities underwrite it with the overheads on teaching lots and lots of students. That is something we cannot do. That is not an avenue open to us unless we think we can put 30,000 students on this campus. I would argue we wouldn't want to do that anyway, even if it were open to us. And the other problem that has sort of caught me off guard is we have had an enormous shift to medical research. This was not true when I came in 1995. It has happened with exponential growth that is continuing to this day. This university is all about fundamental research. We are not particularly geared for applied research in the medical sciences. The John Curtin Medical School, which has done great 2 Nobel Prizes, is really about fundamental research, which can be funded by the NMHRC, but it's not a place where we can grow into. We don't have a huge clinical hospital nearby. We're obviously trying to think about how to get that going, but we are at a huge disadvantage on this front. And you can see in the graph that ANU at the top is completely dominant in ARC, Australian Research Council, per FTE. That shows how good we are in the spaces we're good at. Unfortunately, the government has been putting more and more money into the NHMRC where we're not competitive as an institution. Our growth in that, well, has been zero, despite the amount of money coming into the NHMRC growing. Because we've sort of saturated our capacity, as near as I can tell, to garner NHMRC money. So everyone else's income is going up, and ours isn't. And this has flow-on effects, because we get money as part of a common pool based on how much of the total pool we get. But we're not accessing the rapidly growing part of that pool. And unfortunately, this grant called the RIBG isn't growing as fast as the total money is, so we're missing out doubly. And so this means that while our revenue is flat, a place like Melbourne, and not just Melbourne, other institutions, pretty much all of them, are going up. And that means that the total revenue of all sources here, you can see where, having had a huge advantage in the past, that has been erased by 2009, and that is continuing today. This means that when we look at our research output now, while we produce more papers per person, We do not produce papers with higher citation rates anymore. If you multiply that together, it means that our total output per researcher is almost identical to the University of Melbourne. And so this leads us to an inevitable question which is going to be asked. Why do we need a national university now? Total research output per Commonwealth dollar is about the same as us in Melbourne or University of Queensland. The University of Queensland and University of Melbourne are aligned to the very clear government priorities in health. We are not. UQ and UNIMELB produce more degree students per Commonwealth dollar spent than we do. Why not just give the money to UQ and UMELB and be done with us? That is a question that will be asked. The answer used to be because we were just simply better than them. But by the numbers I have just shown you, and these are the numbers the government has, and I don't think they're cooked completely. I won't say they're perfect, but the answer I think now has to be because we are a useful, very different part of the research sector. And we have to focus on being different, of differentiating, and not chasing Melbourne down what is ultimately going to be a rabbit hole which we do not come out. If you look at research, we remain at the top of the pool for quality research. 89% of our different research groups were rated as a 4 or 5 in ERA, much higher than any other group. So if we're going to have a way forward in research, I believe that we have to be focused absolutely on quality. No ands, ifs, or buts. It's quality or nothing. We can have no room for mediocrity. We do not have a role like the other universities. We cannot be the university like other universities that have to do a little bit of everything. I think we need to look at every academic area and ask if it's in the top 20 of the world. We have several that are. We have a lot that are close, and we have some that are nowhere close. If we are not in that top 20, we need to ask the question, what do we need to do to become in the top 20? If the answer is there is nothing that we're going to do to ever get us there, then I think we really have to ask a question as an institution, why are we doing that work? Because it's for someone else to do. It's going to be painful, it's not good, it may eventually be my own field of astronomy if we suddenly don't have any research infrastructure supplied by the federal government, which could happen. But for the sake of this institution, that would be the type of decision it would have to make. This will make us different than other Australian institutions. NHMRC funding. I don't really have a great idea what to do here. Can we afford to ignore NHMRC money? Can we compete in this space given how far we are behind? I believe that whatever we do, we need to focus on quality. We need to build around the quality that we have and fill the space only where we are unique in excellence. We should not chase NHMRC money and be no different than anyone else and be maybe not as good. That is, I think, ultimately something that will lead us the wrong direction. So I would urge us to be small, elite, and perhaps look at a very high research dollar per smaller cohort, if necessary, than our competition. I think if we're going to have a way forward, we're going to have to look at how we look at tenure. I'm not saying getting rid of tenure, although it personally wouldn't particularly concern me. It would concern a lot of people. But I think we need to think about how we use tenure within an elite research environment. Does tenure mean a job for life, or does it mean a job while you are productive? What do you do when people become unproductive? It's not a lot of people. Maybe we shouldn't concern about ourselves. But it's more of a symbolic act that we are different than the rest of the country and that we deserve that extra money because we don't get the same perks that people do in the other universities that we might want to consider it. Whatever, I do think it may mean that ANU needs to focus on fewer tenured jobs in the future. That is, that we get our research dollar per tenured faculty up. And we work on early career jobs. There are so many brilliant young people, the market is saturated with them, who cannot find jobs. And we have the potential to put a lot of our block grant into those jobs like we used to, and like we do less now, because a lot of that money now goes into permanent people rather than the young people. I personally think to engage that one other thing we can do is to look at us actually paying for long-term visitors who come from the other universities for a few years to have a research-only environment that stimulates them and allows them to go back to their institutions and compete with us, but maybe collaboratively. That would fulfill our role as a national university. The other thing we can do is look at doing graduate teaching with a difference. That's one of the things we do as a research university. And I personally think the fact that we, generally speaking, do not offer graduate coursework here makes us less than competitive with US PhDs. We adopted the British system. It is hard. There is a move, University of Melbourne going to a 3+2+3 system. I think we need to consider that. In astronomy, we are forcing our students, even within the 3-year system, to take classes. It's awkward, it's hard, it causes a lot of stress. I think it's I think we have to do it, but it's not easy to do that. I think we need to look at involving students in teaching. I'm going to come back to that later. And we have to have recognition that right now, even in an elite department like mine, only 1 in 7 of our current PhDs are headed for academia. And that's because that's the ratio of the number of positions available, and it's not growing quickly, versus how many graduate students we're producing. None of our graduates are unemployed. They all get very good jobs, but a lot of them, most of them, are not going to be in astronomy. And so I think having optional classes, what I'm going to call life skills, so that people will get a good understanding in a quick, short form of economics, policy, and business, would be incredibly valuable. You don't have to force people to do it, it's all optional. But many, many of our students would love this option. And through the Crawford School, I think there's an obvious place to offer things like this. And indeed, I think it would be useful to be made nationally available to other graduate students across the country. This is a capability we have and others don't necessarily have there. So a place where I think it's easy potentially to move forward is on undergraduates. We are already different in this space. Now, it's ironic that we're different in this space because, of course, ANU's undergraduate program was an afterthought. But I would argue right now that we have clearly a different undergraduate program than any of the other G8, and arguably the most elite. Actually, not arguably, it is the most elite. And I think that is a place where we need to consolidate. The great universities of the world get their reputation as much as anything from their undergraduate cohort. It gives you great alumni, it gives you great recruits into your graduate programs, it gives you great ambassadors around the world. And so if you look at, for example, our teaching ratings compared to the G8, we're well above everyone else. If you look at our students, here are the ATAR scores from the last few years. We have almost half of our students now coming in with greater than 95% ATARs. That's incredibly high, and it's grown. It's gotten better over time. As other metrics have declined, this one has gone up, even though we've been raising our students' numbers considerably. So we are neck and neck with the University of Melbourne of having the best median ATAR scores, but this is a place where I think we can consolidate. As I was looking through things, I think we always perceive of ANU as being a relatively small institution. But by world standards, we are not. We are only small in Australia. We have more undergraduates than Harvard. We have more undergraduates than MIT, more than Stanford, more than almost any of the top 15 universities in the world. And that is something that gives us the option to do something that no other place in Australia can do. That is, we can be different in this space, easily. In 2004, there was a review, which I vaguely remember occurring, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do in this space, and I read this review, and pretty much it said exactly what I was thinking. This review was incredibly distinguished in terms that it had some of the best university administrators from around the world. The head of Caltech was the head of it. What they recommended was that ANU focus on a research-led elite undergraduate program of about 6,000 students. There were 7,500 students on campus at the time. So they wanted to shape it a little smaller. And since that time, we have developed a research-focused program, but it doesn't apply to everyone. We do have a significant fraction of students on campus. One of the recommendations was to have students actually be embedded on campus, especially in the first year. And student numbers, though, have increased to 10,500 from 7,500. And we have had, starting right now, 2014, a Tuckwell Scholarship Program that really does provide a small cohort a unique educational experience that I would say looks a lot like what I saw at Harvard. So those are great things. So I think this is the easiest place to differentiate. We are the only place small enough to have an elite undergraduate program. And I would say this is the easiest way to be MOOC-proof, is because you can provide something that me on a computer and everyone else around the world computer can't. An interesting experience. I personally see us needing to shape the number of undergraduates here. We really want to provide a Harvard-style, Cambridge, Oxford-style capability to about 8,000 students, but not only based on ATAR. I want us to have interviews. Harvard does it, Cambridge does it, Oxford does it. Why? Because we need a diverse group that matches the type of person that belongs at ANU. It means we'll be different. We're the only one who can do the interviews. It'll take lots of cooperation, but I really think it's important. I would argue that we need to have a college experience for the first year, which involves tutors, intramural athletics, an academic head of house, members of house from the academic staff, tutors on every floor, alumni coming in and doing. This is the way it is done at the great institutions of the world. We do it a little bit here. And I would argue you can only opt out of this by exception. You have to have exceptional circumstances not to do this. If you don't want to do it, then my view would be go someplace else. Plenty of opportunities. There are enough great students. By making ourselves different, I don't think getting people here will be a problem. I would even argue that we should look at extending this college experience later on to even a broader, to even later years. Because, again, it is what the great institutions of the world do. And there's a reason they do it. Excellence in undergraduate means we have to have excellence in teaching. Undergraduate research or special project, which was recommended, no longer is an option. A lot of people do it, but a lot of people don't. If you want to have an elite group and you want to come to ANU, you've got to do something special. You just can't be the student who shows up and goes on. We need to be different. I would argue we need tutorials, 15 or less, per each class. So you have enough tutorials, each or less. That's what we had at Harvard. It's a great way to get people focused in on their education. And also it gives you a chance to have your graduate population linked into the education. Is it expensive? Well, yes and no. We offer top-up scholarships to a large number of students now. And I don't think they would mind actually having this being a prerequisite of that top-up money. So you can leverage a lot of money out this way. I think in the end we need to look at ensuring we teach great classes here. And I think a future expectation for tenured faculty would be the expectation that they do teach one class per year, a very low load. I'm not saying 3, I'm saying 1 class per year, or a half a class and some graduate and stuff. That is what I would describe as a Harvard load. It doesn't seem to wipe out the Harvard faculty. You can have research-only positions built in with other responsibilities. I think it would be wise to have a few elite teaching professors giving named and prestigious positions. Harvard does that too. We have some great people here, and they can ensure that the rest of us teach to our full capability. These people already exist. You just have to raise the status. It costs almost nothing. So what are the implications for this for Canberra? Well, ANU will be much harder for locals to attend, and that is different than currently. So I think ultimately that would mean an expanded role to the University of Canberra, and to have people go interstate, which is, of course, the way the US deals with this. If you live in Cambridge, you do not assume that you're going to go to Cambridge or to Harvard or MIT, depending on the Cambridge you live in. And if we're going to have a great university here, you can't have the same expectation. I would see us having cooperative programs and classes to maximize what University of Canberra is in the future. Engagement, my last topic. We're based in the national capital, and we can and we do interact with the Commonwealth government, especially now through the Crawford School. That was one of the recommendations of 2004. And we have done that, and I think the Crawford School is young but growing rapidly in reputation. But our engagement is unfortunately, or fortunately, measured by the rest of the world by the amount of external dollars we raise. It's probably not the best measure in my opinion, because I think it would be kind of distortionary, but like it or not, we are a cellar dweller in this state. We raise less external funds per faculty, per any measure you want, by a large fraction compared to any of the G8, and we underperform on international standards. I think this is an area where we have to do better. We lack a culture of engagement with industry. Australia lacks a culture of engagement with industry, and we especially do. I would argue that there are real no incentives from government. There are actually disincentives for the university to do this, but I predict that there will be incentives in the near future. And if there are, and we are not doing better in this space, we are once again going to get hammered. University of Sydney and University of Queensland are probably out in front in this space, but I would argue no one in Australia is doing well. There is a place where we can quite quickly change and do better. I think it must be a priority for the ANU. I don't have any golden or silver bullets here. I think we need to be creative in this space. We can use our existing successful alumni staff and students to mentor people who are interested in participating with industry. I think we need to have a view where we ask not what industry can do for us, but what we can do for industry. We need to go in and talk to industry and come up with ways that interest them. We can't completely distract ourselves, but we can find common interest. But it has to be interest that is interesting to them. We need to break, if we're going to do that, a lack of mobility between industry and academia through potential joint appointments that eventually lead to joint projects and joint students. When I say joint appointments, I mean people who have a foot in both camps. Not everyone, but a few people who serve as ambassadors between the two. They necessarily have a conflict of interest, and that may bother some people, but without that conflict of interest, you end up with nothing happening. You need to have people whose future reputation rely on putting things together. You could imagine having leave arrangements as a version of policy rather than having to negotiate something that is not terribly well defined. Sensible super arrangements, almost impossible, especially if you have an old super arrangement, a defined benefit scheme to move into industry right now. There's not easy ways to fix that. And I would argue that for some positions need to have criteria that include industry experience in them. We also have the opportunity, because sitting just over the road here, we have a huge complementary institution, the CSIRO Black Mountain facility, which is getting larger, not smaller. We are a stone thrown away from that campus. We have an opportunity to benefit from their research expertise, which is good, their industry experience, which is vast, in areas of national interest, which we are related to. They have the opportunity to benefit from our research expertise, which is also vast, our students, and our training. One could imagine joining the two campuses physically, I'm not saying as an institution, but a physical joining of the campuses. You will note that there is a road between the two of us right now, Clooney's Ross, which is conveniently small. Talk about that in a second. We can imagine joint appointments, not virtual but real, ones where people are 50% CSIRO, 50% ANU, who again have that, that conflict of interest where they must bring the two institutions together. That could lead to joint research programs and students. I think that's an instant way for us to get up to speed on industry, at least in one sector, quite quickly. You would argue that this joint program would instantly become one of the top couple places in the world. We're already doing stuff with them. I'm talking about doing a lot more. But if we're going to do something bold like this, we have to act fast. Because this plan was released last week. I don't know if you've seen it, but the plan is to close Northbourne Avenue, because it's cluttering up the middle of Civic, and to divert all traffic into a largely expanded Cluny's Ross Road. Now, I'm not saying we should go out and protest to close Cluny's Ross Road, but there are ways, if we're upgrading that road, to make it so that it does not become a chasm that forever makes it impossible for CSIRO and ANU to come together meaningfully. It is perhaps that space a great and perhaps the only place to put a high-tech industrial park when one is warranted between the two places. If we just let a big Parks Way-style road go through there, then nothing will ever happen here. It is an opportunity that is gone forever. But we have the opportunity, because they got to work on this now, to get what we want and need here. But it's going to behoove us to work quickly with CSIRO to do something before this road's plans are made. All right. So ultimately, we need some policy settings. We need government to reward quality. ANU cannot afford to have its block grant indexed or not indexed away or not indexed against inflation if we are to have a national university. That is what has happened. That has been a policy for as long as I've been here. If we continue to do it, we will be exactly like every other university. There's nothing we can do about it. And we have to make the case that we are different, and that money needs to at least be held fixed, and preferably, if we do differentiate in a positive way, even increase. But I would argue we should not be asking for other universities' money when we do this, because that will ultimately undermine the case and undermine what we are here to do, which is to make the entire sector stronger. So I would argue that the future of the ANU is ours to make, that ANU is a great university now, not that it's no longer great. It is a great university now. In the future, I would argue we need it to be greater, but it could be lesser. But I hope I have convinced you today that it cannot be the same. Thank you very much.
So that we went a little longer than we expected.
I'm sorry.
Not at all. I think we'd be sorry if we hadn't.
Okay.
However, we do have some time for Q&A, and in doing so, I'm also asking that you're happy to stay a little longer. The food might be a little cooler, but the refreshments will follow. So maybe we have a few questions, and could I ask that they be succinct, to the point questions, so we can get a few more in. Thank you. We've got roving microphones coming around.
Thank you. There are moves afoot at this university, I know particularly in CAS and elsewhere too, eliminate precisely the kind of model you're talking about, which is to say a research-intensive contract where a research fellow who teaches their research, focusing, say, on one really good course a year, to going to sort of normal academic contract with a lot more teaching and a lot less emphasis on research. What do you feel about research fellows, what the role has been, and what the role of research fellows, research-intensive contracts should be for the future of ANU?
All right, well, I should say, I probably was going to say this, but I forgot, is that I want this to be, I don't have all the answers. I want this to be sort of a conversation, and if you don't like what you've heard today, that's fine, but let's talk about it. That's what I want to happen. So I would argue that research fellows, which is what I was a long time, that was my, I was actually not even a research fellow. I was just a postdoc when I did the work that won the Nobel Prize. But I would argue that research fellows should be research intensive. That's what I would argue that we want them to be. I do not mind them being involved in a small way in teaching through helping provide tutorials. It would be okay to have someone do a small amount of that, and I think that might even be good for them. I also envision teaching specialists, which could be hired at that level. But I want to make it very clear to the people who are teaching specialists that we don't get into the place where you're supposed to be a teaching specialist and do research at the same time. I have sat on promotion committees at this university where a person had won every award they could in teaching. And the argument was we shouldn't promote them because their research isn't good enough. Now, I screamed bloody murder and managed to get them the promotion. But we need to recognize that great teaching is great teaching and is important to this university. And we can be different. We can actually say, a few of you, your job is to be a great teacher, and you're going to be judged on that. If you want to do some research, that's great, but we're not going to judge you on that. You are 100% judged on your teaching. In the same way that the reality is, I teach, but I'm 100% judged on my research. So do some if you can, but that would be, I guess that would be my argument.
Thank you for a very great talk. Absolutely fantastic. But let me just point out that one of the points that you made could have been extended a bit. And that is the contrast between the early funding and the more recent funding which has been gradually overtaking it. All of those Nobel Prizes and people which you talked about earlier were under the old funding model. The people on campus made up their minds about funding those people. And they earned their Nobel Prizes from ANU funded grants. And so I would characterize what's been going on as a creeping bureaucratization of not only of ANU, but the whole of the Australian system. And if I'm sure it would be possible to use the comparison of what's gone on in ANU, with it gradually losing control over what it's using its money for all the marvellous things you spoke about, is the same for the whole of the system. And if we then contrasted the whole of the Australian system with what's going on overseas, I think that there will be clear evidence that the creeping bureaucratisation here and in the UK has actually been antipathetic to proper research. You actually need to have the research workers, in this case the university, making decisions about what goes on. So I would have thought that the case of ANU could be used to actually go back to the system that we had before, rather than going down the gurgle with the rest of the world.
So I don't disagree with what you've just said. I have made very strong, I've made a strong request to both government, to the ARC, to consider looking at a notion of mini block grants, so that rather than, right now we have a system where it is peer reviewed, but we are such a small grouping of people that ultimately anyone who can review my work is conflicted out. And so my work is always reviewed by people who don't really know it in detail to actually judge the project. And generally speaking, the best people are the experts of the world in their area, and they know best what they should work on. And you're always judged by people who aren't the expert, especially in a country of 23 million as opposed to the EU with 350 million. And so this leads to almost all of the grant money being given out as you say, in a fairly funny way through ultimately what is track record, but with lots of strings on the money. And ultimately the decisions are made by people that aren't you. Furthermore, each dollar you get, 66 cents has to be provided by the university. And so other people are making the decision of the work you can do, and you're having to put 66 cents on the dollar to make that research happen. So I think it would be much better to have a system in place which money, we acknowledge the shortcomings of being in a country of 23 million people, and we hand money out in a way which essentially allows the money to be strategically used over 5 or even 7 years by researchers by what they think's best, and then to judge them on their track record directly. So I strongly believe that. That is sort of what we got to used to do. One would argue we didn't have a lot of, the rest of the country would argue there wasn't a lot of feedback about if we did a bad job with our money, and that's the argument they used to take it away. So I'm not sure we're going to change that, but I do agree with your point.
Brian?
Brian, you said the money is where it was. There's also the question of patience. It seems to me that what we did have in the past was patient money.
Yes.
And that's, I think, what you're getting to when you said that a minute ago. I just happened to read recently something from James Watson, which said if you want to be creative, you have to be a little bit unemployed. And it seems to me that encapsulates something of the creative process. Somehow or other we have to not be too busy, and so somehow or other we have to get to that.
Okay, so it's certainly true that you need to be, I think you need, I guess I would maybe say it's not too busy. I think for certain times, great creativity does come in probably that situation where you have a fairly stable situation. But I think a lot of work happens where you just think it's the thing you want to work on with all your passion, so you have all your time to work on it. So I wouldn't call it quiet. My time was certainly the intensest time of my life, where I did the work that won the Nobel Prize. And providing an environment which is stable enough, long enough for people to get in and do there. My problem, I had a 3.5-year project, and I came this close to leaving the field in 1997 because I applied for a job at this university in 1997 to continue the work that won the Nobel Prize, and I finished 4th in the job. And it was only because 3 people turned the job down that I stayed here and finished my Nobel Prize. So that is a consequence of long-term stable funding. But I would argue it's really good to have it in young people, because I personally find young people are the people who are really creative, and the people who have that just amazing passion to do nothing else with their lives. And I'm not as productive as I was when I was 30. I'm sorry, I'm just not. I'm wiser, but not more productive.
Good evening, Professor. Thank you for a fantastic quality-based model for A&E. Just wanted to know your take on budget solution given by VC a few months ago about increasing the student number by maybe normally by 2%, still growing the student numbers, and increasing the international fees as well.
So, if we want to go through and grow the student, that makes money. There's no doubt about it. I should say that, my shaping us to 8,000 loses us money. Although it's not clear, we know how much it loses us. You would have to change the nature of the faculty to make it balance, okay? So it's not an easy solution. If you increase numbers, you can make a little bit more money. But I think we will find it hard to be an elite institution. We certainly can't house everyone on campus. I think you will find that our ATAR scores will slip and we will get more and more mediocre students. And I would argue that that is a losing game because we don't differentiate. We end up being second or third fiddle. And then again, we get to that question, why are we different? Why should we be funded? And government policies can change very quickly. An elite institution's reputation has a 20-year window associated with it. We build this up, then we have that elite status, and although it may cause some financial issues short term, it will help ensure we stay around long term when whatever the future government policy is. The current settings, I have argued, are stupid. I think they will be changed because most people in government realize that they are causing problems. And so why try to guess what government policy is going to be when it changes? It's changed 4 times since I've lived here already. We need to have a foundation which we think will always work. I think elite will always work. And we have the opportunity of being the only ones who can really pull that off, given our nature. So, you know, that's why I would argue we have to take a long-term view, not a short-term view. That being said, I don't have to pay the bills.
So Brian is the person who does have to pay the bills.
Yes.
Just to let people know, Brian and I absolutely agree on the diagnosis of the problem. We've talked extensively about this. So I absolutely agree with the comments Brian's made. And I absolutely agree that the type of institution he describes would be the one that I would aspire to as well. But let me add some pragmatism to it now. The reason that I want to grow student numbers is we need money.
Yep.
We need to pay the bills. And under the current funding environment, as you have very clearly described, that's the model. That's the business model for an Australian university, and we don't fit that model. To reduce, as you say, from 10,000 students to 8,000 students, with top of my head, is probably about $60 million or thereabouts in funding. And that means we're going to have to make some really, really difficult decisions, you know, as to who no longer works at this university. So I don't have the answer to the question. I don't have the answer to that problem. I've, for 3 years, tried to find the answer to that problem, and I have to say it's been very difficult. I think the questions you raise are ones that we as an institution need to debate. They're going to be very, very difficult for us as an institution to debate. But what I would call upon all of the staff and students of this institution to do is to actually approach this with a really open mind, because the sorts of issues that you raise are indeed the critical ones for the future of this university, and they will not be easy to answer in the current funding mix.
Okay. Just in case the media is here in any way, shape, or form, you wouldn't do a one-year transition to 8,000 students. It would have to be something that would be shaped over time, and you would do through natural attrition and rearranging how the university is done, if you were going to do it. I think the best way to do it is to get a sensible government policy that does not go through and clobber excellence, which is what the current one does. So it's a fundamental flaw in the current system, and that's the obvious way to change things. And University of Melbourne will benefit from this too, which is a good thing, because Glenn's got a very persistent voice.
Professor, I think I broadly agree with pretty much everything you say. The reputation and quality of this institution is the reason why I came in the first place and I'm back. 2 things especially resonated with me. One was this idea of being different, and the other was the idea of engaging with the industry. And I'm thinking especially about the climate crisis that we're facing. I'm sorry to raise it, but we can't burn all of the world's fossil fuels and meet our normal 2-degree target by the time that happens. By the time I'm your age, you will have passed the threshold, be very close to it. The ANU is a world centre for various clean tech and climate change research, but it also invests quite heavily in fossil fuels. And I was wondering about your thoughts about political nature of engagement with the industry in general, and specifically about investment.
Well, these are always, when we get to how we invest, that becomes an interesting question. So if we're going to, I think doing the best fossil fuel, research on climate change is a huge thing that we do well, and we should be very proud of that work. Should we go through and do a stand and say we should not invest in companies which engage in fossil fuel production? It's not completely clear to me that those 2 things make a lot of sense, even from a fundamental view, because if we're going to change how we use fuel and how we don't pollute our planet with more and more CO2, or enrich it, depending on your point of view, it's going to require a fundamental change, and it's going to require those companies to change. So are we helping pressure those companies by not investing in them as a organization? If we are, I would say it is a minute perturbation to their balance sheets in the end. I don't think we affect their price much. You can disagree with me, but I'm afraid that my economist wife would run it through you and show you how the money would just come someplace else. And so it's certainly symbolic, but I'm much more keen on getting outcomes rather than symbolism. I'm not a strong symbolic person. I really like outcomes. So I would concentrate on getting us to change policy through the Crawford School, through our research, through outreach, to get those companies to invest in new things, which means that they are not polluting or enriching the atmosphere in CO2.
I'm sorry, but we really will have to hold questions, but if you're quick, you might be able to talk to Brian when he's had a cup of coffee.
Excellent.
Can I just, on your behalf, say how significant it is that you should talk with the aim is place in the national and international perspective, Brian, and encourage us all to reach for the stars, as it were, because also today, of course, the 24th of October is United Nations Day. And I'm sure all of us here this evening are a cosmopolitan group representing many nations and many cultures, so that's significant. It's great to have your own experiences to reflect this international understanding. And I'm sure that you've opened up a lot of skills of thought this evening, which is obvious in the questions and the many more that I'm sure could come. You've certainly challenged our Order of Australia members, and more particularly, of course, the Australian National University members who are here this evening. And not only for ANU, but for the future of the national capital. I mentioned your vineyard, so we thought it would be infra dig to present you with a bottle of lesser quality wine this evening.
Better not be one of these two.
So rather than that, you said that you're always a positive person, which means your glass is always half full, never half empty.
Exactly.
So on behalf of the Order of Australia Association, I'm going to present you with a set of our glasses, which I'm sure you'll keep filled to the brim.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you. Oh, very nice. Beautiful.